So, are we a rich country? I'm going to start with Oxford, and with this city, because I'm guessing almost all of you live in Oxford. Was anybody born in Oxford? Excellent. We've got one, maybe two. Very good. Welcome all the rest of you migrants. You're very welcome here. Uh, One problem with Oxford is it's known around the world. If you try and find out about the city, if you Google Oxford, you can't find anything about the city at all because the university has taken over in virtual space. It's almost impossible to find out about this city. What's interesting geographically about Oxford, if you do what I do, is that if you look at the wards of the city, then we have a tenth of the wards are in the poorest tenths of wards nationally, a next tenth in the next tenth, the next in the next tenth, and we have exactly 10% of wards or people in the top 10%. And this is the city in England that is closest to the national distribution of income. It's the most typical city in England, which you may not think of. You may think, oh, this is a gentrified rich city. But quite a lot of England is gentrified and rich. A lot of London is a lot richer than here. And this is actually an average city, except it's not average because you don't tend to get places which have equal proportions of people living in each social group. And of course, despite the fact that this is an incredibly mixed city, what happens is that people don't mix. Okay, you have these divisions. You have the university and the town. You have the second university. We've still got a third university. It's now part of University of West of London, I think it's now called. We have a whole plethora of schools. If you're going through educational geography of the city, but these schools are remarkably divided, possibly more divided than schools anywhere else in Europe. We may be the most educationally divided city on the continent. And this relates to the key question about is this a rich country? Because one way in which we stay rich is bringing people in. So we now have a plethora of international schools, most of which you won't know their names in the city, charging 40, 45, 50, 55,000 pounds a year. We have children being put up in the spare bedrooms of homes of people in the city. We have about a third of the 15-year-olds going private. We have more private schools than state schools, even though it's only a third of the 15-year-olds. The two-thirds are going to about 6 large secondaries. Those large secondaries are divided by cliffs of house prices, which are about 100,000 high. Matthew Arnold and Charwell at one end, next to Cheney, down to Spires, which used to be Oxford Boys, down to whatever the Catholic school is currently called. It changes its name periodically. In fact, all the schools, all the state schools changed their name. Even Charwell became the Charwell, just before it was recommended by Tatler magazine. Except for Cheney, which is my school, which hasn't changed its name. It's a rich country. It's slipping down the ranks. This is hardly surprising. We easily forget that this is the centre of the largest empire the world has ever known, the richest empire the world has ever known, and an empire which only really came to an end shortly after the Second World War. Right? Victoria was an empress. The king was an emperor. We received tribute in various ways through terms of trade which were not particularly fair, which meant that we had wealth which was unimaginable. But we didn't do what other empires did. We didn't build colosseums or enormous palaces. We spread the wealth out, but only amongst the upper classes. So we had huge country houses, magnificent train stations, not the one at Oxford, but because that wasn't allowed in the city. Um, so it can be a confusing place to look at, this country and this city. Most of the buildings of this university are empire buildings. Luckily for us, a few of them predate empire. Um, so, as you're saying about Bristol, you're lucky you're not there because they're currently struggling as they agonisingly slightly change their university crest to remove one of the merchant venturers from it, but they'll spend another 30 years slowly redesigning it. Could be done faster. Oxford doesn't have this particular issue because the original buildings predate. Um, so we can kind of pretend, oh, it's all 800 years old. But of course it isn't. Right? The vast majority of the riches of this place began with the Empire. The Radcliffe camera. John Radcliffe did not make his money by being a doctor. You don't, as a doctor, even as a doctor to the king, make the kind of fortunes that John Radcliffe made to allow so many buildings to be named after you. That's our past riches, of which there is still quite a lot. But in my lifetime, we have fallen down and down and down the scales. And some people feel this acutely. I don't, as you'll be able to tell. It's not something that particularly upsets me. But then I'm lucky. In my life, I have got jobs. I've become a professor 3 times. I'm doing okay. But if you're not doing okay, this sense of falling down can be acute. And I think it really matters at the moment. That's why there's a more serious side to what I'm talking about, because we're at a point in our politics where we're on the edge of something that could be quite dramatic, and it's connected to riches and the place in the world. So GDP, fourth, fifth, sixth, maybe edging towards seventh in the world. But the vast majority of that GDP is only enjoyed by a tiny proportion of people. By income, the best off 10% of us are taking 40% of everything every year, leaving just 60% to 90% of the population. So for 90% of people in the UK, this is a country that has half as much as it officially has when you look at the amount of money and divide it out. And within that 10%, which I'm in, and probably the majority of you are in or your parents are in, there is more inequality in that top 10% than there is in the other 90%. Hardly anybody in that 10% thinks they've got enough to get by, despite the fact they've got so much more than everybody else. Why is this? Part of it is memory about the riches. I first went abroad when I was 15. There was a coach that picked us up from Cheney School, and it took us to France. And it was very, very, very exciting, going to a country where people speak another language. Our teachers were ridiculously young, because Oxford has had this issue about being too expensive for a very long time. It is more expensive now than ever. You have to go to San Francisco if you head west to find somewhere that's equivalent. It is hard to find places in London which are so unaffordable. The advantage in London is there's always somewhere you can live, whereas in Oxford that no longer is the case. Um, but we had young teachers in the 1980s. My mum gave me £1 to go to France. Back then, £1 converted to 10 francs. If you think a franc was rather like a euro. That's how rich this country was when I was a child. 3 francs would buy you a bottle of wine. And I had 10. And I was 15 years old. And our teachers were young. Okay? But that is what it means to be rich. And this is the memory. And I can go back to my parents or to my grandparents and their memories of Europe and of just how poor Europe was after the war, most of the mainland. All my granddad's reflections of empire. He was born in 1916. So this is a kind of fall down the ranks. I've been here in the university for just over 11 years, and it's fascinating watching or trying to observe how new visitors to the university see it. And this isn't scientific. Most of what I do, I measure things, but this is people's impressions when they first arrive. Now, if you can remember Oxford, for those of you who were here in 2016, 2017, 2018, the shock was actually homelessness. We had the second highest number of homeless people after Manchester, the second highest number of deaths. The shock was, I've come to this supposedly wonderful place. Why am I walking past people outside the train station and so on? What's going on? But it was a kind of San Francisco shock. If you've ever been to the US, your first time you ever go there, it's what on earth is going on? Doesn't mean that San Francisco's poor, does mean that inequality is very high. By 2009, the UK had become the most unequal country in Western Europe. Gordon Brown's, this is trying to gear you up for questions later. Gordon Brown, who was Chancellor and became Prime Minister briefly, picked 1 million children out of poverty, but by such a small amount that it wasn't noticeable on the statistics. The mantra of that Labour government, the man who's just discovered he's not going to be Chancellor, Peter Mandelson, sorry, I shouldn't smile. The mantra, it's very odd, British politics, to be, as a Labour Party person, to be happy that it's William Hague and not Peter Mandelson. The mantra was, it doesn't matter what the rich earn as long as they pay their taxes. Inequality is not an issue. We're going to get trickled down by taxing the rich. Now, let's speed up a little bit. Brexit. It's an oddity that the first country to leave the EU after Greenland, you may not have noticed that Greenland left before, was the UK. It shouldn't really have been the UK. It should have been Greece or Bulgaria or somewhere small and in trouble. After all, we had largely engineered the EU to be how we wanted it to be. We'd helped create its structures. We had lots of our officials there speaking English. It was a rich men's club. It was about free trade. It was to our benefit. Greenland left, by the way, under a very nice deal where people in Greenland can still go to Denmark and actually come to the EU. And we still support things in Greenland because they have fish, and the fish are worth a lot of money. Turned out as we were negotiating to leave that we didn't have fish, or that many, or something worth a lot of money. And we weren't supposed to leave. It wasn't really a plan. It was a kind of muddling about, which had to all do with riches. Because there was this perennial issue that has been going on for decades of why are we the poor man of Europe? What is going wrong? Why is our productivity not higher? On the right, this is we're hamstrung by the European Union is stopping us take our rightful place in the world again. At the extreme of rightful place in the world, and it's not far from here where this happens, imagine you have a debate between a scientist and a bishop about the origin of human beings, and that debate is there is such a thing as evolution and survival of the favoured races, which is the subtitle part of it of that book. A very heated debate about human beings and what we are, of which the conclusion, largely agreed by the majority of people in the world now, is that evolution is a real thing. And some of the ramifications of that, which aren't necessarily true, is that some people are fitter and cleverer and better because they have some genetic superiority. And who might these people be? Well, if you're sitting in the richest country on earth with the largest empire ever known, and the origin of species is published where you are, it's got to be you. It's got to be you. And you want to go out around the rest of the world and let them benefit from your immense cleverness and beneficence and so on. there are still people who believe in this superiority of the true-born English men and women occasionally. I can laugh about it, but it is not something that has gone entirely away. And part of that fueled the kind of Mayfair Club hedge fund meetings behind Nigel Farage and his friends over those years leading up to 2016. John Major talked about being stabbed in the back by people trying to get us away from the yoke of Europe, which was controlling us. David Cameron promised to put it in the manifesto and then did in 2015 because he thought they weren't going to win. He couldn't believe that the Conservatives were actually going to get an outright majority. They go and get an outright majority. George Osborne tells him not to do it, but being a man of his word or being supremely overconfident due to coming to this place as an undergraduate and never having failed in his life, David Cameron agrees to go ahead with a referendum, which looks as if it's going to do the right thing because everybody that matters in this country is on one side. All the political parties, Conservative, Labour, Liberal, Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, the Greens, the Church, the trade union movement, the CBI, everybody is for stay. And the spread betting is that it's going to be a narrow Remain win. Then an MP is murdered a few days before the poll. And then we have a poll, and then it turns out people don't do what they were supposed to do. And 52% or 51.9% vote to leave. The first time you've ever given them a vote that might really matter, because most people know their vote doesn't matter in their constituency. And only 48% vote to remain. Well, that shouldn't have been a problem, because that kind of thing happens in referendums in Europe. And what you do is you have another one, or it's advisory. Okay. You normally find a way of sorting these things out. You tell people it's democratic, but if they do the wrong thing, you deal with it some way. The interesting question is, how did we fail to do that? We tried, hence the debates, the years, the soft Brexit, Theresa May's struggle, eventually Boris coming to the fore, his 2 letters, his ego, again boosted by this place. We have a certain responsibility over this whole thing. And then we crash out. And we can't judge the effect of our crashing out because our crashing out coincided with a pandemic. Very convenient for not being able to measure it. It wasn't, obviously, there wasn't a conspiracy theory of doing that. But you look at the situation now in 2024 and how we rank compared to other countries in Europe. I'll give you one statistic. I can do far too many. The United Nations has for years monitored poverty and child poverty across the rich nations of the world and a few less rich nations. Of all the nations it measures child poverty in, the one which had the largest increase in the most recent 7-year period was the United Kingdom. And that was also of Europe, one of the countries with the highest rates of child poverty to begin with. We stand out like an absolute sore thumb. The reason I call this book Peak Injustice is it's really hard when you've just done as badly as that to carry on doing as badly as that. To uplift you a little bit, when you look at the United Nations graph, if I had anyone, I'd show it you. In well over 2/3, heading towards 3/4 of every country they look at, child poverty is falling and falling rapidly in most of them, falling by 1/3 in 7 years. In a lot of Eastern Europe, in Korea, which, if you remember the film Parasite, is a kind of poster country of inequality, falling in Japan, even falling in the United States slightly. Right, so there's good news worldwide. There just isn't good news here. And it's a mixture of 2 things. One is this incredible rate of inequality By 2014, we managed to beat almost every country in Eastern Europe. Half of them are fairly equal, half are unequal. Apart from Bulgaria, we're heading towards beating Bulgaria to be the most unequal country in Europe. And then at the very same time, our average living standards have been falling. Our income as a country has been falling. And you put these two things together, and the result is fairly toxic. The result means that when we measure life expectancy, we found it falling for men and women in 2015 as compared to 2014. This doesn't happen normally. And 2016, 2017, 2018. It rose slightly in 2019, then fell again. Our health is poor. Infant and child mortality has been rising in absolute terms for the last 3 years. The latest data release was last week. Nobody bothered to report it because we're so sick of reporting these things. Sorry, this is down. I can carry on. The saddest stories, well, you get used to them. Babies in Oxford who's never been washed in warm water because people can't turn the heating on. This didn't used to happen 10 or 20 years ago. But this is happening in a rich country. So we are a rich country, but we're a rich country in trouble. And the last time this happened, the last time we were at this kind of peak was 1918, just at the end of the First World War, when we were in trouble because that war wasn't supposed to have lasted very long. It did. We borrowed money to pay for it. We had to pay it back. We introduced wealth taxes, in particular inheritance taxes on the rich, and because we're British, we did it in a very British way. They donated their property to National Trust. We redistributed. From 1918 right through to 1970s, almost every year, income gaps fell. So we became one of the most equal countries in Europe. Sweden was slightly better than us. We introduced the most successful health system in the world. We introduced the most successful social housing system in the world, copied by other countries. By the 1960s, we were introducing the most equitable education system in the world, copied later by places like Finland, who kind of did it properly, but they got the idea from us. It's not a very clever idea. It's just called a comprehensive school, and you all go to the same school. It kind of works. But we've gone backwards. And it's partly the rallying against not being so rich, because it's really tricky being unequal and getting poorer. I think it explains a lot of things, but I think about 2-3 minutes. How am I doing? 5 minutes. Okay. Let me give you one example, which my friends at the Guardian newspaper absolutely hate, but I think this gets to the heart of things. If you look at the reporting in the Guardian newspaper in the year 2019, between May and December, in May, the Labour Party were 10 points ahead in the polls. Labour actually were set to win. This was with Jeremy Corbyn as leader. Now, there's a lot of people who really didn't like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. They had produced a manifesto in 2017, which was, I think, leaked in 2017. So it was nice and raw and actually very honest, and turned out to be popular. The swing to Labour in 2017 was at least twice as fast as the swing in 1945 per year. Incredible, which is why Theresa May didn't have a working majority. So these things were popular, but they were popular amongst voters. They were popular amongst the 500,000 people who joined the Labour Party, the largest social movement in Europe, who were not all closet Trotskyists, because 95% don't know what a Trotskyist is, right? I can remember getting phoned up by Labour headquarters saying, "What are you doing going to this meeting in Surrey?" And I said, "It's a maths teacher." And they went, "We think it's a cell of the SWP." Anyway, but there was paranoia. But the Guardian newspaper, and this really annoys my friend Polly Tolbein, but you can go and look at the Guardian rather than listen to the recollections of people who wrote for it. The Guardian began in those months to stop supporting the Labour Party or even the Liberals so much, and not to attack Boris Johnson as much as they were doing. Why did they do this? I think it's partly subconscious. If you are working near King's Cross in the Guardian and you're high up, and you're on a salary of, say, 80, 90, 100, maybe 130, this is only a minority of people in the Guardian, but you're the people who matter. You're the people who are most powerful at the 10 o'clock news conference. Have editorial control. You're making the decisions about which journalists to promote and which not to run any stories by. Peak Injustice is dedicated to Dawn Foster, who's a journalist that The Guardian dropped, who's now dead. If you're making those decisions, it may be subconscious, but you can look back and see when you have a political party, in this case the Labour Party, suggesting that it is going to introduce policies which will increase taxation directly on the top 5% of people, that's people earning over £80,000 a year, and will increase public spending every year for 5 years up to, and this is where they failed in many ways, they should have said, up to just below the level that Germany spends, which is not the Nordic countries, it's not France, it's actually a European average. But 5 years is a very fast route to get towards German levels of public spending. It's an extra billion a week for the health service, by the way, if we had done it. It means you have an education system which is almost entirely state funded and so on. If you promise that, what you are also saying is that you are going to radically alter the lives of the best of 5% very, very quickly. Now, I'm in the best of 5%. Okay, I told you I was in the 10%, but to be honest, I'm in the best of 5%. Doesn't give you much away, by the way. Most professors are in the 3% or 2%, depending on who they live with, and how well they're doing. Had those policies come about, the rise in income tax and wealth taxes, and probably luxury taxes on other things that people like me do, such as fly on holiday, would have been enough to have altered my lifestyle. It would have made it impossible for me to send my children to a private school if that's what I've been doing. It would have made it difficult for me to go skiing, difficult for me to have more than 2 holidays a year, would have made it hard for me to give my children a deposit to help them buy a flat somewhere. It's hugely life-changing. It's the kind of thing you need to do if you want to make the UK a normal European country. It's the kind of thing you need to do if you're going to cope with becoming poorer, but it was too much for the Guardian to stomach, because it might not have worked. And then what happens? All that happens is that you're living in North London and your child is going to the local comprehensive rather than to the very leafy private school 2 miles away. All that happens is that you're worrying about your grandchildren trying to get social housing because you haven't sorted them out through some trust fund that you've created. Right? It's scary. And that's the biggest implication, I think, of being a rich country that's becoming less rich. People with money and with assets try to protect they, themselves, and their family as if there's no such thing as society. 1 in 10 people last year used private healthcare in the UK. Not 1 in 10 patients, 1 in 10 of everybody. It's your cataracts, it's your hips. Not asking for much. And being asked to believe that something else is possible in a short amount of time was too much for the Guardian. And hence we get a landslide of Johnson in 2019. Hence, bang, we get the fast Brexit. Hence, we get 3 prime ministers in a short number of years. The other country which did this, by the way, was Bulgaria, the other most unequal in Europe, except they had elections for them. We didn't. And hence you get what we got a few months ago, which is Labour win with a massive majority, but with fewer votes than they had in 2019. Because the far-right party of Britain, now Reform, changes its name, is well organised enough that even though Sunak goes fast, because he can see they're getting well organised, completely split the vote. And what I'll leave you with, for drinks, is what happens if Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage make a deal? What happens? What happens then next? And that's what I think people should be focusing on, because quiet policy of doing things slowly within OBR rules is probably not enough to placate the British public, who are willing to vote against how they're told to vote at various times, who simply want for their grandchildren, and it's older people with grandchildren who vote the most, simply want their grandchildren to have what they had. What they had was full employment, being able to get a home and start a family in their 20s, and not living in fear. And that's what it feels like to be a very unequal country becoming less rich. Thank you for letting me talk at you.